I remember the exact day I stopped believing in second chances. It was 3 months after my divorce was finalized, and I was sitting in my apartment staring at the empty walls that used to hold pictures of a life I thought was forever. Sarah had taken everything that mattered to her, and I'd let her. Not because I didn't fight, but because by that point I was too tired to care. 54 years old, and I felt like I'd lived 100 lifetimes already. The apartment was on Jefferson Street, a quiet neighborhood where most people kept to themselves. That's exactly what I needed. No one asking questions, no one offering pity wrapped up in sympathy. Just silence and the sound of my own thoughts, which weren't much better than the silence anyway. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed the old man. I was taking out the trash, moving through the narrow corridor that led to the back of the building, and I saw him sitting on the stoop next door. He was impossibly thin, like someone had stretched his skin over bones and called it a person. His clothes hung off him in a way that made me uncomfortable to look at. White hair, wispy like spider silk, and hands that trembled when he tried to light a cigarette. He must have been in his 80s, maybe older. Time had done a number on him. I didn't think much of it at first. You see old people everywhere and you learn not to stare, but something about the way he sat there, completely alone, watching the street like he was waiting for someone who was never going to come, struck something inside me. Maybe it was because I recognized that look. I'd been wearing it myself for 3 months straight. For the first week, I just nodded at him when I passed. He'd nod back, sometimes manage a small smile. His name was Mr. Callahan, I learned eventually. One of the neighbors mentioned it in passing. "Poor old guy," she'd said. "Been here for years. No family left. Just him and that empty apartment." No family left. Those words stuck with me more than they should have. By the second week, I started noticing things. The way his hands shook worse on some days than others. How he sometimes just stared at nothing for hours, his jaw working like he was having a conversation with ghosts. I'd catch glimpses of his apartment through the open door on hot days, sparse, almost sterile, like he'd given up on the idea of living and was just going through the motions of existing. I told myself it wasn't my business. I had my own problems. My own life was falling apart, my career was stagnant, and I'd just spent the better part of 2 decades building something that dissolved the moment my wife decided she didn't love me anymore. The last thing I needed was to take on someone else's burden, but I also knew what it felt like to be invisible, to sit in a room full of people and feel completely alone, to wonder if anyone would notice if you just stopped showing up one day. It was a Thursday night, about 3 weeks after I first saw him, when I finally did something about it. I'd made a pot of pasta, simple marinara with chicken breast, nothing fancy, and I had enough left over for another meal. I stood in my kitchen with the container in my hands, debating with myself. This was crossing a line, getting involved. Opening yourself up to obligation and complication when your life was already too complicated. Then I thought about my father. He died when I was 28, and I was out of the country when it happened. I never got to say goodbye, never got to tell him the things I should have said. By the time I got back, he was already in the ground. I'd spent the last 26 years wondering what his final days were like, if he was alone, if he thought about me. I grabbed a plate, filled it with pasta, and covered it with foil. My hands were shaking a little as I climbed the 3 steps that led to his stoop. He was sitting in the same chair, same position, like he hadn't moved since morning. Up close, he looked even worse than I'd thought. His skin had a grayish tint, and his breathing was shallow. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have lost the ability to be surprised by anything. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice low and easy. "I made too much pasta. You want some?" He stared at me for a long moment. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, trying to figure out if this was real or if he was imagining things. Finally, he nodded. Just once. barely perceptible. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was paper-thin, barely there. I set the plate down on the small table next to him and turned to go. "No problem," I said. "I'll probably make some again next week." I didn't look back, but I could feel him watching me as I walked back to my apartment. That became our routine. Every Thursday, I'd make something, pasta, chicken, soup, rice and beans, and I'd leave it on that small table next to his chair. He'd be there, always sitting in that same spot, and I'd approach with the food and nothing else. We didn't talk much. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he'd whisper thank you. A few times I caught what might have been a smile, though it was so faint it might have been my imagination. Weeks turned into months. Fall came and went. The leaves on the street changed from green to gold to brown, and Mr. Callahan seemed to fade along with them. He got thinner, if that was even possible. Some days he looked like he barely had the strength to lift the fork. Other days he'd eat everything I brought, and something that looked almost like life would flicker across his face. I found myself thinking about him more than I expected. Not in an obsessive way, but he'd pop into my head at work, and I'd catch myself wondering if he'd eaten the food I left, if he was warm enough at night, if he was scared. Sarah used to tell me I had a savior complex, that I was always trying to fix things that weren't mine to fix. Maybe she was right, but this felt different. This wasn't about fixing anything. This was just about showing up. My therapist asked me about it during one of our sessions, why I was spending so much time and energy on a stranger, what I was getting out of it. The question annoyed me at the time, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized the answer. I was getting something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I was getting the feeling that maybe I mattered, that my presence, my small gestures, made a difference to someone. It wasn't much, but it was something. By winter, Mr. Callahan looked like he was hanging on by a thread. I'd bring the food, and sometimes he'd be asleep in his chair, his head tilted back, his breathing barely visible. On those nights, I'd carefully set the plate down and wait a minute to make sure he didn't wake up before I left. The building's landlord told me Mr. Callahan had refused to go to the hospital, said he didn't have insurance, didn't have money, and frankly, he was ready to go. He was just waiting for it now. I remember feeling something crack inside me when he said that. The idea that this man was just sitting on a stoop, waiting to die, with no one to mark his passing, that resonated too much with where I'd been just months earlier. The place where you stop fighting and just accept that this is it, this is the end. So I kept bringing the food. Every Thursday, without fail. And I started staying a little longer, sitting on the edge of his table, not saying much, just being there, present, visible to each other in the way that two invisible people understand. January came, and it was brutally cold. I worried about him out there, but he wouldn't budge from his chair. I started leaving thermal blankets, which he accepted without protest. Small things. A thermos of hot coffee. Once, a pair of gloves that he actually wore. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. It was the middle of January, and the wind was cutting through the street like a knife. I had the container of chicken soup in my hands, still warm from my stove, and I was climbing those 3 steps to his stoop like I had 100 times before. I was rehearsing the week in my head, work stuff, personal stuff, nothing important, and I was already thinking about what I'd make for next Thursday. But when I got to the top of the steps, something was different. Mr. Callahan was standing up, actually standing, on his own 2 feet, which I couldn't remember ever seeing him do. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles were white and his entire body was trembling. But his eyes were wide open and locked on me with an intensity that I'd never seen in them before. "Watch out!" he screamed. His voice, that paper-thin whisper that I'd gotten used to, suddenly cracked like a whip across the street. "Please, stay. There's something I need to tell you. Please, please, don't go." I froze. The container of soup was still in my hands. Every instinct I had was telling me to put the food down and leave, to not get any more involved than I already was. But something in his voice, desperation mixed with something else, something like urgency, like fear, kept me rooted to that spot. "Okay," I said slowly, carefully. "Okay, Mr. Callahan, I'm here. What is it?" He sat back down heavily, like standing had taken everything he had. He was breathing hard, his whole body shaking, and when he looked up at me, there were tears running down his face. "Please," he said, "please sit for just a minute. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you months ago. But I didn't have the courage. I still don't, but I won't get another chance. And I can't let you walk away without knowing." My heart was pounding. I set the soup down on the table next to him and sat on the edge of the chair he was sitting in, my mind racing through 100 different scenarios. Was he sick? Did he need me to call someone? Was he confused, caught in some memory? "What is it?" I asked. "What do I need to know?" Mr. Callahan closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was something different in them, something like clarity, like he'd made a decision that was both terrifying and necessary. "My name," he said slowly, "isn't actually Callahan. Not really. That's been my last name for 60 years, but it's not the name I was born with. And the reason I'm telling you this, the reason I had to tell you before I can't tell you anymore, is because you look exactly like him, exactly like my son." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I must have made some kind of sound, because Mr. Callahan, or whoever he actually was, held up a trembling hand like he was asking for patience. "Please," he said, "please let me finish. I've been waiting for this for so long, and I don't have much time. You need to hear this." I nodded slowly, not because I understood what was happening, but because there was something in his voice that demanded to be heard. Something that suggested that whatever was about to come out of his mouth had been waiting decades to be said. "Sit," he said again, more gently this time. "Please." I moved from the edge of the table to an old wooden chair that was leaning against the wall of his building. I dragged it closer and sat down facing him, my mind still spinning, trying to make sense of what he'd just said. "I had a son," he began, his voice steadier now, like speaking these words had given him some kind of strength. "A long time ago, before I was who I am now, back when I was younger, before I made all the mistakes that led me here. His name was Michael Thomas. That was my name too before I became someone else. Michael Thomas. I'd never heard that name before in my life, and yet there was something about it that made the back of my neck prickle, something that felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. When Michael was born," he continued, "I was 23 years old and completely unprepared to be a father. His mother and I weren't married. We were young and stupid and in love, or thought we were. Her name was Catherine, beautiful woman, kind. She deserved so much better than what I gave her." He paused here, his eyes closing again. When he opened them, they were wet. "We had Michael, and for the first year or so I tried. I really did. But I was working 2 jobs, and Catherine was struggling with postpartum depression, and I was angry all the time. Angry at the world, angry at myself for not being ready for this responsibility. And instead of being the man she needed, instead of stepping up, I made a choice." I found myself holding my breath. "I left," he said simply. "When Michael was 14 months old, I walked out. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed space, that I'd come back when I had my head on straight, but I never did. I met someone else, Diane, and she had her own problems, and we got married, and I built a whole life that was built on the foundation of my absence, on the foundation of abandoning my son." The words hung in the cold air between us. I understood on some level, what he was telling me, but I still didn't understand why he was telling it to me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, and I heard the tremor in my own voice. "Because," he said, and he reached out his hand towards me, "I think you might be Michael, or the son of Michael. You look like him, exactly like him. You have his eyes, the same shape, the same color. I've been looking at you for months, and every time I see you, it's like looking at a ghost of the past, a ghost of all the things I lost because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the concrete. "No," I said. "No, my father's name was Robert Hayes. He died when I was 28. He raised me and my mother, and he was a good man. He was nothing like what you're describing." Mr. Callahan, Michael Thomas, was shaking his head slowly. "Robert Hayes," he said softly. "That was Catherine's maiden name. That was her family name. She gave him her name. That makes sense. That's exactly what she would have done." Everything inside me wanted to walk away. Every rational part of my brain was telling me this was a confused old man, probably in the early stages of dementia, latching onto a stranger because he was desperate and dying and his mind was playing tricks on him. But there was another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, that was remembering fragments of conversations with my father. The way he'd never really talked about his own parents. The way there was this gap in his history that had always seemed strange to me. "Do you have any proof?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "Any documentation? Anything at all that would suggest what you're saying is true?" "Inside," he said, pointing to his apartment with a trembling finger, "there's a box under my bed. It has letters, old letters from Catherine, and photographs. Photographs of Michael when he was a baby and photographs of me from before, from a long time ago." I didn't move. I couldn't. The idea that this frail, dying man sitting in front of me could somehow be connected to my father, to my entire history, to the very foundation of who I thought I was, seemed impossible. And yet, I was walking toward his door like my legs had a mind of their own. The apartment was exactly as I'd imagined it would be, sparse, almost monastic in its emptiness. A bed, a chair, a small kitchen area with barely anything in it. Everything was old. Everything smelled like time and loneliness, and the particular way that places smell when someone has been slowly, inexorably dying in them. Under the bed, in a cardboard box that had softened with age and moisture, I found what he'd described. Letters, dozens of them tied with a faded ribbon, photographs, their colors muted and their edges curled with time, and underneath it all, a birth certificate, a real one. Michael Thomas, born to Catherine Thomas Hayes, father listed as Michael Anthony Thomas. I stood there in that dim apartment, holding a birth certificate that supposedly represented the missing piece of my family's history, and I felt something shift inside me. Not a revelation exactly, but a recognition, a piece of a puzzle that I hadn't even known was missing, suddenly revealing itself, and with it all the implications of what that meant. "Why didn't you ever try to find him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was still standing, still holding the birth certificate like it might burn my hands if I held it too long. "I tried," Michael said from behind me, his voice breaking. "When I was 30 years old, I tried. I went to the address where they'd been living, but it was empty. They'd moved. I didn't have the resources to search further. No internet back then, no way to track someone down easily, and the truth is I didn't try hard enough, because part of me was relieved, part of me was grateful for the excuse. By then, I'd built a new life. I had other children with Diane. I had a career. I had a life that didn't include the consequences of my failure. I turned to look at him, and he was sitting on the edge of his bed, looking smaller than ever, like admitting this had taken the last of his strength. "What changed?" I asked. "If you'd made peace with it, what changed?" "I didn't make peace with it," he said. "I just got better at living with the guilt, better at burying it, better at convincing myself that it wasn't my responsibility anymore, that he was better off without me, which was probably true. But when you get old, when you get really old and you're faced with the end of things, you stop being able to hide from your choices." And I started remembering things. His face when I held him for the first time, the weight of him in my arms, the way he used to look at me like I was the most important person in the world. And I thought maybe I could find him. Maybe there was still time. "And did you?" I asked. "Did you find him?" "I looked," he said. "Once Diane passed, once I had nothing left to lose, I started looking. I hired a private investigator, spent money I didn't have, because I needed to know what happened to him, if he'd had a good life, if he'd been happy." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "The investigator found out that Michael had a son, that he'd married a woman named Susan, and they'd had a boy together, that he'd died when that boy was 28 years old. And I thought that was the end. I thought I'd never get to make this right, that I'd wasted whatever opportunity I'd had." I sat down slowly on the edge of his bed, the birth certificate still in my hands. "My name is David Robert Hayes. My father was Robert Hayes. My mother was Susan. I was 28 when he died. I was born in a year that would make me the grandson of the man sitting next to me. All of it was lining up. All of it was pointing to a truth that I'd been living my entire life without knowing it. This frail, dying man sitting next to me was my grandfather. The emotion that came with that realization hit me like a wave, not just sadness or anger or betrayal, but all of it at once. This man, my grandfather, had abandoned his son. He'd spent decades not trying hard enough to find him. And yet my father, who'd apparently known or suspected the truth, had never told me, had never given me the chance to know my grandfather. And now, when it was almost too late, here I was, discovering him at the end of his life. "I never knew," I said finally. "My father never told me any of this." "I know," Michael said. "Catherine told me in one of her letters that she was going to raise him as her own. She said she was going to give him the name Hayes, and she was going to raise him to be a good man. She said that even though I had abandoned them, she wasn't going to let that define Michael's life. And she kept her word. From what the investigator found, Robert Hayes was a good man, a devoted father. He raised you well, and that was all I could have hoped for." I looked at the photograph in the box, the one of the baby, Michael, being held by a young man who looked roughly like me. Or rather, I looked like him. The resemblance was undeniable now that I was looking for it. The same eyes, the same shape of face, the same slight asymmetry to the smile. "Why now?" I asked. "Why tell me this now when I'm dying?" he finished. "Because I didn't want to die without you knowing the truth. I didn't want you to carry your life without understanding where you came from. I didn't want to be the missing piece that you spent the rest of your life wondering about. And I was hoping that maybe, just maybe, you might sit with me for a while, before it ends, before I become another ghost that you never got to know." I felt something break open in my chest. This man, this stranger who was also my grandfather, had been sitting on this stoop for months, watching me leave food for him, knowing who I might be but unable to say anything until he was desperate enough, sick enough, close enough to the end that he had nothing left to lose. And I realized in that moment why I'd kept bringing him food, why I'd felt drawn to this dying man on a stoop. It wasn't about being a savior or fixing something broken. It was about something deeper, something cellular. It was about blood recognizing blood, about family calling to family across the distance of decades and silence. I set the birth certificate down on the bed and took his hand in mine. It was paper-thin and trembling, but his grip was strong. "Tell me about him," I said. "Tell me about my father. Tell me about Michael." And as the afternoon light faded through his small apartment window, Michael Thomas began to speak. He told me about Catherine, about his failure and his guilt, and his desperate, belated attempt to change the course of a life he'd already set in motion decades ago. He told me about my father, the son he'd abandoned, and the man that son had become. He told me things that reframed my entire understanding of my family, my history, and most importantly, myself. The days that followed were different from anything I'd experienced before. Michael remained in his chair, but something had shifted fundamentally. The urgency that had kept him alive seemed to ease, as if he'd finally placed the crushing burden he'd carried for so long onto my shoulders. Or perhaps he'd simply accepted that he could rest now, that his confession had lifted something unbearable from his chest. I noticed the change immediately in the way he breathed, in the way his eyes would close without that frantic quality they'd had before. I started visiting more often, not just on Thursdays, but on weekends too, sometimes on random weeknights when I couldn't sleep and found myself thinking about him alone in that apartment. I'd bring coffee, soup, sandwiches, conversation. Mostly I brought myself. Michael seemed to need my presence more than the food, though he still ate what I brought, slowly, methodically, like each bite was a small act of connection between us. He told me stories about my father that I'd never heard before, small details that filled the voids that had always been there, those inexplicable gaps in my understanding of who my father really was. How my father was obsessive about cleanliness to the point of compulsion, scrubbing the kitchen at 2 a.m. if something felt out of place. How he was terrified of heights, but would climb to the top of buildings anyway because he didn't want people to know his weakness. How he cried during old movies, thinking no one was watching, his shoulders shaking silently in the dark of the living room. "He was a decent man," Michael would say, his eyes fixed on the street beyond his window, as if he could see through time itself. "Better than I ever was. Better than I had any right to expect. And you have that from him too. That decency, that ability to care for people even when you're broken yourself, even when you have nothing left to give." I began bringing documents, my birth certificate, photos of my father that I kept in a forgotten album at home, images I hadn't looked at in years because the pain had been too sharp. Michael held them with both hands, trembling violently, as if they were made of the most delicate glass and might shatter at any moment. He studied each image like he could recover years of absence through the photographs, like if he looked hard enough, he could see the man my father had become, could understand the legacy of his abandonment. One afternoon, he asked me to call someone. A number he'd kept on an old, yellowed piece of paper, preserved in the box under his bed all these years. It was my aunt, my father's sister. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. But when I dialed, there was no answer. Michael's face fell when I told him. We sat in silence for a long moment before he told me the truth. She'd died 8 years ago. He didn't know. All those years he'd been carrying that number like a lifeline he'd never had the courage to use, and by the time he'd finally gathered that courage, the bridge between our worlds had been burned long ago. "I looked for her too," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd tried to find her in the 80s when I finally got my act together, when I realized what I'd lost, but I couldn't track her down. And then it was too long. Way too long. Time has a way of making cowards out of all of us." February came, and the cold intensified in a way that felt personal, aggressive. I started bringing more blankets, thermal ones that actually worked, hot tea, winter clothes that he needed desperately. But you could see it clearly now. He was reaching the end. His body was giving out, Some days he slept most of the time, waking only to eat a little and to say my name, like he needed to confirm I was still there, that this wasn't some final fever dream his dying mind was conjuring. One day, while he slept, I went into his apartment and started organizing that box, the letters from Catherine, yellowed and fragile, written in her careful hand. The photographs, their colors faded, but still holding traces of a life that had been lived decades ago. The documents that proved beyond any doubt that I was his blood. I put everything in a leather folder I found under the bed, something that had survived all these years. I wanted everything in order. When the time came, and I knew it was coming soon, I didn't want to have to search through chaos while dealing with the weight of grief. Michael woke when I was doing this. He just watched, in silence, while I took care of his belongings, his history, his entire legacy. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just gratitude, pure, unfiltered gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely, "for keeping this, for not letting it all get lost to time, for caring enough to preserve it." I spent the night there that day. I sat in a chair next to his bed, and he talked until exhaustion pulled him under. He told me about Catherine again, painting her in words so vivid I could almost see her, about how she smelled like lavender even in winter, how she sang while preparing lunch, old songs from her childhood that he'd never heard before or since, how she forgave him but never forgot, how forgiveness and memory lived together in her, complicated and real. "I don't deserve your time," he said at one point, his voice breaking. "You should be living your life, finding someone, rebuilding after your divorce, moving forward. You shouldn't be here with me, watching me die. That's not fair to you." But I knew exactly why I was. Because my father had died without resolving this. Because there was a chain that started with Michael abandoning my father as a baby, that led my father to carry that wound silently his entire life, that led to him not telling me the truth, that eventually led to me, at 54 years old, finally understanding why I'd always felt like I was missing some essential piece of myself. "You're my family," I said simply. "That's reason enough. That's all the reason I need." In the last week of February, Michael became very weak. The doctor who visited said it was a matter of days, maybe a week if we were lucky. His body had practically stopped functioning. His breathing was shallow, his heartbeat irregular, but his mind remained clear, crystal clear, like his body was finally releasing its grip and his consciousness was sharpening as a result. One night he asked me to bring paper and a pen. With trembling handwriting that was a shadow of what it must have once been, strong and confident, he wrote a letter. It took hours. Each word seemed to cost a piece of his remaining energy. His hand would shake so violently sometimes that he'd have to stop and wait. But he persisted. He needed to say these things, to put them in words that would outlast him. He finished finally, and he handed me the sealed envelope with both hands, like he was passing something sacred. "Open it after," he said. "After I'm gone, not before, promise me." I promised. I placed the envelope under my pillow, where I would sleep that night in his apartment, keeping vigil. By morning, he had gone. I found him in his usual chair, as if he'd simply fallen asleep in the middle of watching the street. His hands were rested in his lap, peaceful, his face more calm, more at ease than I'd seen it in months. There was no struggle in his expression, no pain, just rest. I sat with him for a long time before I called the ambulance, just holding that moment, understanding that I was witnessing the end of something that had only just begun. The ambulance came. The paramedics were professional, gentle. I made the necessary calls, answered the questions, handled the paperwork that accompanies death, forms in triplicate, questions about next of kin, medical history, cause of death. I answered them all in a daze, like I was watching someone else do this, like I was observing my own grief from a distance. And when it was all done, when his body had been taken and the apartment was empty, except for his furniture and the weight of his absence, I opened the envelope. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal. The letter was addressed to me. Of course it was. David, if you're reading this, it means I've gone. It means I've finally rested. I want you to know that these last months with you were the happiest I've had in 60 years. Maybe the happiest I've ever had, if I'm being honest. You saved my life, not just by bringing food to a dying old man, but by bringing purpose, by making me feel like maybe, in some small way, I still mattered, that maybe my existence meant something. I spent most of my life trying to compensate for mistakes I couldn't fix. I tried to be a good husband to Diane, though she deserved better than what I gave her. I tried to be a good father to my other children, though the shadow of my failure with Michael was always there, coloring everything. I tried to be a good businessman, to accumulate things that didn't matter, but there was always an emptiness, a space reserved for the boy I abandoned, for the man he became, for you. You inherit now not just my name, but my story. Guard it well. Don't hide it, but don't weaponize it either. Tell it to your children if you have them. Let them know that even the worst failures can be understood, if not forgiven. Let them know that redemption doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending it didn't happen, but accepting it and trying to be better. It means showing up. It means telling the truth when it would be easier to stay silent. It means caring about people, even when you've given them every reason not to trust you. Your father was an extraordinary man, better than I deserved to be, better than I had any right to expect. He built a good life from the wreckage I left for him, and he never let what I did define who he was. He raised you to be decent, to be kind, to care about other people. And you continued that legacy. You embody it in ways you probably don't even realize. I am at peace now. For the first time in my life, I am truly at peace. With all my love, Michael Anthony Thomas, your grandfather. I closed the letter with trembling hands. I was crying. There was no one there to see, no one there to judge. Just me and the ghost of a man who became real only in the final months of his life, who changed everything simply by telling the truth. I arranged the funeral, a small ceremony, just a few people. Some of Michael's other children came, curious about me. I didn't know them, and they didn't know me, but we shared DNA and we shared the knowledge of his passing. I placed the photo of him with my father in the casket. That image of baby Michael being held by a young man who didn't yet know how devastating choices, how moments of weakness, how single decisions could ripple across generations, could shape lives in ways you never anticipated. In the months that followed, I did research. I discovered that Michael had left a modest inheritance, nothing extraordinary, nothing that would change my life in material ways, but enough. I donated most of it to organizations that helped elderly people in difficult situations, homeless seniors, people aging alone. Michael's second chance came too late for him, but it could help others. I found Catherine, not her personally, but her grave. It was in a cemetery next to my city, in a plot that my father had maintained for decades. He knew. Somehow, my father had always known the truth. He'd kept it from me, protected me from it perhaps, or maybe he was just protecting himself. I placed a plaque there, a small one, simple, with her name and the dates of her life. And underneath, the phrase that Michael had written in one of the old letters I found in the box. You gave me everything, life, forgiveness, the chance to be better. I will never stop being grateful. I went back to Michael's apartment one last time. I cleaned everything carefully. I donated his belongings to people who needed them. But I kept one thing, that chair where he used to sit, where I'd sat with him so many times. It's now in my living room, positioned by the window. Sometimes I sit in it at night and think about everything I've learned, about parenthood and its terrifying responsibility, about abandonment and its long shadow, about redemption and whether it's ever really possible, about how people we cross paths with, strangers at first, can completely change the meaning of who we are. My divorce doesn't disappear just because I found my grandfather. Sarah and I still made choices that led us to where we were. The pain is still real, but somehow now I understand that my pain, my failures, my own struggle with meaning and connection, it's all part of a larger story that extends back further than I knew. Michael Thomas taught me, unintentionally, that you're never too old, never too close to the end, to try to fix things, to seek forgiveness, to tell the truth, even when it costs everything. I would have spent the rest of my life never knowing he existed if I hadn't left food on a doorstep, if I hadn't recognized in a stranger the same loneliness I saw in myself. Now, when I sit in that chair, I feel his weight. I feel the lives of 3 generations of men who fought their demons, who tried to be better, who finally found each other in the dark. And I think that maybe, just maybe, that was always the point, that we have more time than we think, that the people we meet can redefine us completely, that redemption isn't a destination, but a choice we make every single day. Thank you, Grandpa, for trusting me with your story, for giving me the chance to be part of yours, for showing me that it's never too late to come home.